Hello everyone, I'm Shruti Kumtekar, Marketing Manager at Kloves. Thank you for joining us in our Kloves monthly webinar. Today's webinar topic is using performance analytics to gain insight into employee performance. I'm going to take a couple of minutes to go through housekeeping, talk about Kloves, followed by a presentation by our panelists, and finally the Q&A. This webinar will be recorded and you will be able to access it later. For Q&A, you're on mute. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A section in your Zoom control panel and our panelists will answer them. If you have any questions that are not directly related to the webinar, please email me at shruti@closing.com or sales@closing.com. Our social media channels are listed here and you can access our previous webinars at our Kloves YouTube channel. About Kloves, we have been a ServiceNow partner since 2011 and we are based out of Santa Clara. We are a full ServiceNow shop with 150 plus customers and close to 50 consultants, and we've been executing projects globally. In terms of services, we provide end-to-end services. Our focus most recently has been on customer service management, end user portals, and mostly HR service management. We've been doing a lot of kiosks also of late. Our panelist today is Omar Hamid, Technical Consultant at Kloves. Omar, thank you and looking forward to this webinar. I'll stop sharing at this point and let you take over.
Thank you, Shruti. Let me share my screen here. Okay, so thank you everyone for joining. Like Shruti mentioned, my name is Omar Hamid. I am a technical consultant with Kloves. My focus over, recently has been really around performance analytics and looking at different ways that we can leverage some of the data in our clients' instances to really get some valuable visualizations into what they're working with, really leveraging performance analytics to its full capacity. Some of the things that I'll talk through throughout this webinar, I'll first go through kind of a basic training, if you will, of performance analytics, just talking about the terminology that's used in ServiceNow. I know there's some terms in there that everyone's not entirely familiar with, so I'll just do a quick brush up on those. There's going to be a lot of terms which you'll hear me beat to death, and I'll be repeating quite a bit. So I think it's best that we go through a brief intro of what some of those things mean. Then I will get into using metrics, which is a tool in ServiceNow, which allows us to get visualizations into some duration data and different data points that we might not get directly from a specific process table, like an incident table, for example. And then I'll also look at how we can use performance analytics against those metric tools with in combination with a database view to get some potential data points that we might not have otherwise been able to get. And then finally, one way that we can kind of tie some of this data together is through looking at it from a perspective of an employee performance score. When I say employee performance score, it's really that's really something, you know, which is customly defined. But what I will walk through is how we can first start to define what exactly is a performance score, and then how we can take different data points in our instance to create a specific employee performance score for a specific group of users in the system. And what I'll introduce to is index indicators, and we'll be able to leverage those to really get sort of an aggregate view from different data points across the platform. So rather than just looking at incident data and saying, okay, you've got all these incidents resolved. That's great. We'll be able to look at ways that we can kind of aggregate some data for maybe incident and request, and then even pull in some change data, and then start to look at how we can formulate a score that will allow us to compare some of the users' activity within the platform against each other. That sort of data can be used as you please. Although some of the use cases might be for just kind of a weekly gamification type deal, if an employee is at the top of the list, and Starbucks gift card or something like that. So that being said, I will jump in and start talking about some of the basic functionality or some of the basic terminology used with performance analytics. And that includes indicator sources. You'll hear me use that term a lot. Indicators, breakdown sources, breakdowns. I'll touch on collecting data. So once we have all these configurations set up, how do we go in and actually retrieve the data? We'll look at scorecards and dashboards, and then briefly touch on some of the security rules before I jump into how we can start to use all those things to start to formulate our employee performance score. So an indicator source it's really just a source record that identifies a table of view, and it's a set of conditions for which to gather that data. So just using a very generic example, the incident table could be an indicator source, and then we would put a condition, as I'm sure we're all used to doing, on the incident table that just allows us to specify which incidents we'd like to look at. So the example I gave here, opened at or before today, which will basically take all the incidents that were opened today or before and allow that to be queried against for our performance analytics reports. And then indicators. So these are the actual statistics that business track to measure the current conditions and forecast trends. They provide you with key information based on the indicator source. There's 3 different types of indicators, one being automated, then manual, and formula. Automated, these are what are used pretty frequently, and they're used to automatically collect scores on a regular basis. Each of these are linked to an indicator source. So using the example of the incident table, an automated indicator would be number of open incidents. And then manual, this is used for data that can't necessarily be retrieved from the ServiceNow instance. So if there's some kind of data that's not currently being tracked in the system, but we'd still like to get it into our report somehow, then what we can do is build out a manual indicator. And in the context of tracking that against employee score, one way that this can be leveraged is if there's some kind of system or tracking methodology for looking at how often an employee was out or how many absences they have. And then we can kind of pull that in using Excel and then include it in some of our index indicators, which I'll jump into later. And then formula indicators are based on historic data of other indicators, or they're based on analytical functions. So although automated are most frequently used, what I'll be looking at, or what we'll be looking at for the purpose of this session is formula indicators. I'll be using, or I'll be showing a lot how we can kind of use a little bit of math and a little bit of logic to start to put together something that will allow us to get insight into how our different employees are doing across the system. And an example there is something like incident backlog growth. You'll notice it has number of new incidents minus number of resolved incidents, and that's a very basic formula for getting incident backlog growth. these each number of new incidents and number of resolved incidents are indicators in themselves, which are being used in this indicator to calculate a new score. And then breakdown sources. These define what values you can select when you apply a breakdown. So if we're looking at, if we wanted to be able to, in the context of an employee score, break it down by an individual user, then what we would say the breakdown source is the sys user table. And there are other ways as well. If we wanted to kind of put it in the context of groups, then we would look at the user group table. Another big one here is breaking it down by state. If you're looking at a list of incidents, you want to break it down by the state. You wouldn't necessarily use the breakdown source of the incident table or the task table, but you would look at the choice table, which houses all the actual choices, and then kind of tie that in using the breakdowns. So whereas the breakdown source tells us the table, the breakdowns tell us the individual breakdown elements, which we'll be using from that breakdown source. So it kind of ties that data from whatever choice or whatever table we're looking at, whatever source table we're looking at, to the table that we're looking to get reporting on. So in the context of using that assigned to source, we would look at the assigned to field on the incident record, which is referencing that user table. And then collecting data. So with every report that we create, essentially what we would want to do is establish two separate data collection jobs. One that's going to run historical data collection. So, we say we build a report and we want to have trending data over the past. What we would want to do is run a historical job at, go back X number of days or X number of months and give me all the data that fits this criteria. And that's typically something that we would build and then run only once. And then in addition to that, we would set up a daily collection job so that it's making sure to keep track of all the new records or all the new updates that are fitting in line with that criteria. And just to talk a little bit about historical data collection and how that ties into the indicator source. So in general, for an indicator source on open records that has conditions based on fields where the values might change during that life cycle of the open record, it would be tough to get an accurate score collection because of the fact that those fields might change. So typically you would want to build your condition for those indicator source data collection jobs to look at data that's not pointing at something that is open and holding a condition that the value might change. And similarly, for indicator source on open records, which has a breakdown based on fields where the values are likely to change, it would also be difficult to collect accurate historical data based on those breakdowns. And the reason for that is it's basically because a collection, it retrieves if we were to use assignment group as an example, it would retrieve the assignment group value for, let's say, an incident, which wouldn't be the same value that the incident might have had 2 weeks ago. And in the historic scores collection job, those breakdowns shouldn't really be included if they're going to be likely to change. And then scorecards. So these are really just display scores, or these are scores for a single indicator, and they allow you to perform a detailed analysis of any metric that an indicator tracks. Anybody who's used performance analytics before should be familiar, or at least have some idea as to what a scorecard is. It's basically just, you know, a snapshot view of the indicator that we're looking to get, and it compares those scores over time and aggregates it over different time periods. And then dashboards. These are nothing new. They're just collections of scorecards and reports and different data visualizations that help improve business process and practices. In the context of an employee performance score, typically what we would want to do is have one dashboard that only X users can see, and then potentially have a different page or different tab for each of the type of employee score. So, and this hopefully will make more sense a little bit later, but as we start to try and define what formula will determine our performance score, there will likely be different formulas for different groups. So if there's one group that handles incidents, then obviously we don't want to include any of the change data in that formula. Or if the help desk group handles incidents, requests, and changes, then we might consider including all three of those factors for only those specific group of users. And that's really how we can leverage these dashboards and scorecards to make sure that only certain users are able to see what we want them to. And then security. So this is a very, although it almost, well, hopefully goes without saying, it's something that we really want to pay attention to, especially as we get into things that might be sensitive, such as employee performance. Typically, it would be that type of visualization or data should only be visible to a specific manager or group of managers, or some kind of supervisor that wouldn't really have, and we wouldn't want to be able to have everybody see everybody else's score unless they had to. And the way that these security rules are configured are against the breakdown sources. So they're basically like ACLs in those breakdown sources. The two ways that that we can break down those security rules are through whitelisting and blacklisting. So if you wanted to create a security list for making only a specific amount of users to be able to see this report, then you would whitelist those specific users, and then inherently if you have whitelist selected, then any user who's not listed in that whitelist list would obviously not be able to see the report or the breakdown source. And then blacklisting, it's kind of the inverse of that. Any elements that are on the list are not accessible to the roles on the list, meaning that anybody who is not on the list would be granted access to the roles. Okay, so now kind of stepping away from performance analytics for just a second, I will talk about metrics. So this is a tool that was introduced into ServiceNow a little while back, which is basically it's essentially two tables, which is housing data that might not necessarily be tracked in if we're using change table, it might not be tracked in the change table directly. So the two tables that we'll be working with our metric definition table and then the metric instance table. And essentially, these metrics can be tracked. We can build a metric to track any change of value of a field. So if we want to look at the changed values for the state of an incident, we would create a metric against the state field on an incident table. This is something that we've kind of seen not many people are leveraging, but it's a very useful tool when we start to tie it into performance analytics, and then take it even a step further and look at different database views that we can leverage to get some real duration metrics and some pretty interesting data points that can really help to identify some bottlenecks in the system. And then the metric definition, it really just defines what should be measured. For example, change state duration, that tells us, you know, that the state of the change was in X state for 2 days. And then metric instance, which is the specific occurrence of what is defined on the metric definition. So that's the actual instance of that state being there for 2 days. And so like each time that state is changed, a record is created on that metric instance table. So looking at how we can tie those metrics into performance analytics, if we were to build an indicator against one of those metrics, we can get some very valuable duration data. So we can start to get things like this incident has been assigned to Joe for 10 days, and then taking it into our, or tying it into our employee score, we can start to look at ways that we can either mark up or mark down Joe's employee performance score. If an incident has been assigned to Joe for 10 days and it should have been fixed in 2 days, then that's obviously not a good thing. And we would want that to reflect in our score. And then we would be able to get things like workloads over time. So if we say, you know, if we're looking at the state of an incident at a given point in time, then we're able to see how much Joe's workload was at that specific time. So if Joe had 14 incidents assigned to him on January 1st and then 10 assigned to him on January 2nd, then we can kind of see that there's been some progress made there. And we can also start to compare that against the actual performance score, which tells us, you know, maybe it'll give us some insight into resource planning. And then some other pretty nifty reports or indicators that we can kind of get by leveraging these metrics tables are average duration of resolved incidents broken down by incident state. So that's a pretty popular one. Things like the average duration of assignments of resolved incidents, we can break that down by assignment group. We can look at the number of new, open, and closed assignments, and the backlog growth of assignments broken down by assignment group or by assigned to, as we start to get into our specific employees' progress. And this is really useful, like I mentioned, in starting to identify where bottlenecks are in the process, and allows us to start to remediate some of those. So if we wanted to create an indicator source on a metric database view, we can do that, which will allow us to look at some of the duration data within context of a specific process. So there are some out-of-the-box database views which join the metric definition table with the metric instance table and a specific process. So your typical ITSM suite tables will be in there. So the metric or the incident metric and problem metric and request metric, those are all out of the box. And if we build indicators against those database views, it makes it easier to report on those metrics while using the attributes of that specific process as conditions. So for example, we're able to get things like the incident state duration of incidents resolved yesterday. And if you don't need the context of that process record, of course, you can build that indicator directly on the metric instance table. And just an example there is the average duration of tickets closed today. And one other thing to note is that it's also possible to get certain duration data points from reporting on SLA tables. So the SLA and SLA task table both house typically some valuable duration data if we're looking at those data points. So this just shows a snapshot of how we would create an indicator source against the incident metric table. Obviously, the indicator source that we have, or the table that we're using here for the indicator source is the incident metric table, which, like I mentioned, is that out-of-the-box database view of the incident. It's a join of the three tables: the incident table, the metric instance, and the metric definition table. And then we can just build some conditions on that indicator source. So as we start to tie that into specific employee performance, we can say, you know, show me all of the incidents resolved today. And, you know, the start is more than 0 hours resolved, and the definition is assigned to duration. So that means that it's looking at the assigned to user and seeing how long that ticket was in that, or how long that incident was with a certain user for, you know, while it was in resolved state. And I'll show you in a few slides how that can tie in to an aggregate employee score. Okay, so then, and this starts to get a bit more complicated, but the concept of index indicators. So an index indicator is really just an aggregate of multiple indicators into one score. And the reason these are useful is because, you know, oftentimes with these scorecards, we're seeing a lot of numbers and a lot of data, but it's really hard to, especially for management who's, you know, kind of looking at things from a high level perspective, it's really hard for them to understand how certain things play a role in you know, how it's being affected. So the reason that index indicators can be effective is because it allows us essentially to have a manager look at a scorecard and basically see, you know, either good or bad. It's either green or it's not. And although it doesn't give the detailed information right up front, it does provide the opportunity to break it down as typical with performance analytics and actually see the data that's feeding into that index indicator score. And this the concept of an index indicator is going to be the foundation of what we use to build an employee performance score. We're going to leverage multiple indicators related to an employee's performance. And again, like I mentioned, the employees, those indicators which we define are going to determine what is a good employee performance score and what is a bad employee performance score, and we get to define what factors are going to come into play when building out that score. And so again, these indicators really give a good view of what the overall picture is. We can easily answer the question of, did the overall performance improve? Obviously, we still get our trending data on these specific indicators, so we'll be able to see those scores over time. And essentially, it's just a formula indicator, just a combination of other indicators. It takes the scores of those multiple indicators and aggregates them, so it kind of gives us that weighted average. So how we kind of define what data is necessary to build out an index indicator. First, we need the actual indicator that we're going to use. So an example there could be percentage of incidents resolved by the first assignment group. So that's an indicator that already exists. Then we want to say, is this something that ideally we would want to maximize or something that we would want to minimize? And I'll show you as when we look at the actual formula, how that comes into play. And then we'd also want to know what's the target or the normal value. What's something that we should accept as, our target value. And those metrics, if they're indicators that are already being used for other reports, we would be able to look at averages and maybe already existing targets to kind of derive these data points. And also another thing to note, as these reports progress, we're able to go in and change the target value. So if today we're saying that the acceptable value is that 70% of incidents are resolved by the first assignment group, and we start to realize that everybody is resolving these incidents, and we're getting closer to 80%, then maybe we want to raise that acceptable value and continually raise the standards of the organization so that we can constantly get better. Okay, so I know this is going to start to look messy, but just bear with me and we'll talk through it. So three things that I wanted to make sure that we include as we talk about building out an employee performance score are, or at least I wanted to build something that would derive data points from three different areas in ServiceNow. So the three indicators that I want to use as an example are the ITSM normalized satisfaction score. So this is actually pulling from the metrics response table. So any good surveys, any good responses to a survey will come back. And also the average duration of assignments of resolved incidents. So this is something that's leveraging one of our metrics tables. So we have an indicator built on a metric, and then an then a percentage of unsuccessful changes. So these, notice, are indicators, three indicators coming from three different sources. One from that metrics response table, one from that the actual, I should say, survey response table here, just so it doesn't get too confusing, and then this from an actual metric table, and then this third one from the changes, from the change table. And remember, I said we need these three factors for each of the indicators that we want to leverage for an index indicator. We need, do we want to maximize or minimize it? What's the target? And then what's the actual indicator that we're going to use? Now, the reason we need to know, do we want to maximize or minimize this, is because it'll change our formula accordingly. So this is the formula for maximizing for an indicator that we'd like to maximize, for an index score basically that we want to maximize. It's notice here when I say maximize, the formula is 100 plus the actual score minus the target, and then divided by the target times 100. So that basically gives us, you know, a very high level view of how well is that normalized satisfaction score for that. And if we break this down by the assigned to user, that gives us kind of a graded view of that that score. And then here, looking at this indicator, which, you know, we'd ideally want to minimize. So the average duration of assignments of resolved incidents, obviously we want, this is something that we'd like to minimize. So if we just say the average duration and our target value is 72 hours, notice it's 100 minus the actual score, minus the target, divided by the target times 100. And then the third, which we'll look at for this specific index indicator or this indexed score, is the percent of unsuccessful changes. So obviously this is something that we'd like to minimize. Nobody wants to have unsuccessful changes. So if our target was 10, which still seems kind of high, then we would say 100 minus the, again, this is representing the indicator, which represents the actual score, minus, and this should actually say 10 divided by 10 times 100. So the numbers, each of these in themselves represent their own indexed score. But what I want to show is how we can use these three indexed scores to combine and aggregate into one specific indexed score, which we can start to use as a formula to build out our employee performance score. And this just shows how these indicators would be built out in the system. So again, I'm calling them index indicators, but essentially they're formula indicators built in ServiceNow, built out with these specific formulas based on the indicator that already exists. Average duration of assignments of resolved tickets, ITSM normalized satisfaction score, and then percent of unsuccessful changes. So these were three formula indicators that I built to give us an indexed score for these three indicators, which already exist, which we will then use to aggregate into one final score, which we can call a help desk employee performance score. So essentially what it's doing is taking those three indexed scores and then indexing them again against the overall picture. So notice it's that same formula, 100 plus if we want to maximize, minus the target, but this time we're multiplying it by 1/3. Now what this 1/3 represents is the weight that this indicator carries for this overall score. So I just have it as 1/3 because, you know, the surveys plus the incidents and the changes, we can say each of those carry equal value. But if we want to say that the surveys, you know, the survey responses represent more than 1/3, we want to say those represent half of this score, then what we would do here is change this to 1/2, and then each of these would be 1/4, depending on, you know, whatever weight we want them to carry. The key is, though, that these weighted scores have to equal 1. So for now, I'll just keep it at 1/3 for each of these, giving them each an equal weight. So our index score for normalized satisfaction, our indexed score for the average duration of assignments of resolved incidents, and then our indexed score for the percent of unsuccessful changes when combined, can give us our overall view into a help desk employee performance score. And then this is just an example of what that indicator would look like. So again, these index indicators are essentially just formula indicators which are leveraging previously built index indicators, or just indicators in general. And I know that it's starting to get a little confusing, so feel free to ask questions going along, and I'll try to keep an eye on that question box if there's anywhere you'd like me to stop or go back over. Okay, so now that we see how we can kind of configure our different data points to get a first pass at a help desk employee performance score, I will show you how we can take that. Well, this is a scorecard which shows you how that employee performance score would look in a dashboard. And of course, you know, it is with PA, you get those options to do different views. This is just kind of that breakdown list of the employee performance scores broken down by the user. So again, these numbers are just aggregates of these scores. This is typically something that we would only want to see at a higher level to get an overall view. It's usually internally defined what that score is, not something that HR or anybody should see. It's something that we would want to use internally to kind of inspire better performance within the group and within a specific group as well. Because if we start to do breakdown sources by assigned to, and we don't have the users scoped, then it's going to start doing these breakdowns for every user in the instance. And although that's not impossible, it could start to get clunky. Okay, so taking what I mentioned with regard to those index indicators even a step further, what we can do is essentially build one of those index indicators for each process that we have in the system. So if I wanted to build a specific incident index indicator, I can take the combination of 3 indicators related to incidents that might be relevant to an employee score, and I can get an index indicator from that, an aggregate value from those scores. Doing the same with the request index indicator, taking an aggregate value of 3 relevant scores which might reflect an employee's performance, and then do the same with the change indicators. Take these 3 indicators which already exist and start to build a score which we can use to get a high-level picture of how well employees are doing with changes. Then I can basically do what I just did here. We can basically do what we just did here to get this help desk employee performance score, only we would get an incident performance score, and then a change employee performance score, and then a request employee performance score. And I can take these different indicators. So if you look at the incident one, it says % of incidents resolved by the first assigned. We're looking at the average resolution time of resolved incidents, and then the incident backlog growth. So notice that the direction here is we obviously want to maximize the percentage of incidents resolved by the first assigned. The target value we could say is 70%. Then the average resolution time of resolved incidents, we looked at this before, we would say, you know, direction, we obviously want to minimize that. Target value, we could say 17.5 hours. And then incident backlog growth. Obviously, that's also something we'd like to ideally minimize. Target value, we could say here is -1. So if we take these 3 indicators and build an index indicator based off of those, then that would give us our aggregate score for incident behavior. And then similarly, we could do that with these three request indicators, which are related to request or to a user's performance as it relates to the request table. And we can take that aggregate score and build out a request index indicator, and then the same with the change. So with request, we're looking at things like percentage of SLAs met. That doesn't have to be specific to request, but maybe the request manager has some kind of, or has this holds more weight with the request manager. Obviously, that's something we'd want to maximize. We'd like to see it at 100% of SLAs met. What's the request customer satisfaction score? We could take that same satisfaction score that we used previously and specify it for requests. Obviously, that's something we want to maximize. Then we can look at average work in progress time. This is something that we would want to leverage one of those metric database views combined with a PA indicator, so that we can get that duration view against a specific state, against a specific request ticket. And again, this is something we'd like to see minimized. Just putting a sample target value in there, 17.5. And then when those combine together as their indexed scores, they can give us one overall request index score, which we can then combine with our change index scores, where we look at things like the average time to close a change, the average number of changes closed, and maybe the number of emergency changes. Again, these are just examples that I'm giving based off very generic indicators for each of these tools, each of these processes in ServiceNow. The way that we define, or the way that you define your employee performance, is obviously going to be different from any other organization. The idea here is just to give you an idea of how you can take some of those data points, some of those indicators, and combine them with other data points across the system and get kind of an aggregate view of an employee's performance through something which we're calling an employee performance score. And then hopefully this doesn't tangle everyone's mind, but I'll walk through it. This is basically just the formulaic version of what's written here. I have the formula written, the indexed score of each of these indicators to allow us to get that incident index indicator, and then we would get our request index indicator, and then our change index indicator, which are each broken down by their own indexed scores. And then taking that a step further, we can combine those three indexed scores into one overall employee performance score. So the idea here, although this is probably a little bit more convoluted than anybody might use, the idea here is to show you basically how deep it can go with regard to showing different data points and building out different data points that would allow us to get that insight into an employee's performance. And essentially what this is, and what this employee performance score represents, is an index indicator of index indicators. So like I said, I hope that doesn't confuse anyone too much, but the idea here is to get that overall employee performance score based off as many or as little data points as we want, leveraging some of the tools that performance analytics has to offer with regard to formula indicators, looking at metrics for that duration data, looking at doing database joins or database views to get different views on data that might not have existed in tables already, and using other indicators to kind of get that score that we're looking for. So, if you have any questions, feel free to ask them. Looks like there's a question asked, can the scorecard be sent out in PDF form or other formats to recipients? Yeah, so with any of these things, there's always the ability to kind of send out these reports that would essentially require building out, well, if you wanted them sent out at a regularly scheduled cadence, then it would require building those out, or building out a scheduled report, essentially, that takes the specific score that you're looking for and sends it out accordingly. And the most difficult part to be able to really get that is, because the although this all, I'm sure, looks confusing with regards to the different formulas that come into play as we start to build out these different indicators. The really difficult part is determining, it's at this point, what are the different factors that come into play? When I say employee performance, what does that mean? For some, it might mean simply, how well are they meeting SLAs? Or for some, it might simply mean, what's the customer satisfaction? And in those cases where it's only really looking at one indicator or one data point, then, building out an index indicator isn't entirely necessary. But there are, and there have been several scenarios where, we've had clients that want to be able to get that view of just get that overall view, and they don't necessarily want to have to look at a dashboard for incident, and another dashboard for requests, and another dashboard for changes. They might want to be able to look at one number and be able to, although not granularly, but still be able to determine how well or how badly a specific employee is doing. One other thing to note is this does not have to be at the employee level. In the context of what I've been discussing, all of these are at the specific employee level. And what that means is the breakdown source, or the breakdown is against the assigned to user, meaning there's a specific user that these data points are looking at. It doesn't have to be that way. You can say, you can call this a group score. So for the help desk group, then you would just break down all of these indicators by the assignment group and only look at the ones that were assigned to the help desk. So there are different ways, of course, to play with this data. So it doesn't necessarily have to be that specific employee's score. You can take, the idea here is really just to show how these formula indicators can be used to get aggregate data points from other indicators which show valuable information in the system. And previously it was always difficult to kind of get that that data and to build these kind of custom reports. But with performance analytics, we're really able to get into the granular nitty-gritty of these different tables, of these different records, and really get some good insight as to where are my bottlenecks, what are some things that we can do to really improve our process, and maybe even improve our customer service. Like, for example, if we're looking at a report if we're looking at one of these reports against change that's leveraging a indicator against a metric database view, and it's looking at the change table, and it says that each change on average is spending 40% of the time in a waiting for approval state, then we know that our bottleneck is something to do with the approval process, whether it's a specific user who's not checking their approvals or the notifications that need to be sent out. But we know that there's something wrong with our approvals because 40% of that duration is being stuck in waiting for approval. And that really gives us an ability to go in there and start to fix some of those issues once we recognize where they are. Prior to that, we'd only be able to, or prior to this, we'd really only be able to see, that a change took 5 days to implement, rather than seeing where exactly the breakdown of that 5 days comes from. So I know we're coming close now to the top of the hour. If there are no more questions, feel free to, I know this is a lot to digest. So feel free to shoot me an email. If you'd like to kind of go a little deeper into this. There are some really cool, and we've done some really great things with some of these formula indicators, and it's not limited to this quote unquote employee performance score. So like I said, feel free to reach out, either me or Shruti, and we'll be happy to set up some time and sort of walk you through in detail how these things are implemented at previous clients, potentially how you can leverage some of this data and start building your own index indicators.
Okay, thank you once again, Omar, and thanks everyone for attending our webinar. So if you have any questions, as Omar mentioned, please feel free to send either him a note or send us an email at sales@closing.com or shruti@closing.com. Thank you once again, and see you next month for our next close webinar.